It was the first Christmas Eve at their new house, nestled deep in the quiet woods of Vermont. The air outside was frigid, with snow falling in thick, lazy flakes, covering everything in an untouched blanket of white. Inside, the Baxter family was warm and cozy, the scent of pine and gingerbread filling the air. A roaring fire danced in the stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The tree was trimmed, presents were piled beneath it, and the family of four, Jack, Emily, and their two young children, Sophie and Max, were ready for a perfect holiday. The evening had passed uneventfully. The children had written their notes for Santa and left a plate of cookies and a glass of milk by the fireplace. As they were tucked into bed, Max whispered, "Do you think Santa will really come here? We're so far away from everyone." Emily chuckled softly, brushing his hair back. "Santa always finds his way, sweetheart. Now sleep tight." By the time the clock struck midnight, the house was silent. Emily and Jack had retreated to their room, the only sounds the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft creaks of the house settling. Snow continued to fall outside, the woods eerily still. Then came the sound. A faint, deliberate knock echoed through the house. 3 slow, measured raps at the front door. Jack stirred, groggy and confused. "Who could that be at this hour?" he muttered, slipping out of bed. Emily sat up, her brow furrowed. "Maybe it's a neighbor in trouble," she suggested, though her voice held a note of unease. Jack grabbed his robe and trudged downstairs. The house felt colder than it should have, the fire now a dim glow. He peeked through the peephole, expecting perhaps a stranded driver or a local needing help. Instead, he saw nothing but the snowy expanse of their porch, empty and undisturbed. Opening the door cautiously, Jack looked out into the night. The snow on the steps was pristine, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. A chill ran down his spine, though he told himself it must have been the wind. Closing the door firmly, he double-checked the lock before heading back to bed. An hour later, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Emily jolted awake, her heart racing. "Jack," she hissed, shaking him. "Someone's at the door again." Frustrated but now alert, Jack grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs once more. He hesitated at the door, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then a faint scraping sound, like nails on wood, just beyond the threshold. Jack's stomach tightened. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firmer than he felt. No answer. Against his better judgment, he flung the door open, shining his flashlight into the night. Again, no one was there, and the snow was undisturbed. But just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something odd. The plate of cookies the kids had left out for Santa was now sitting on the porch, empty. The glass of milk was gone as well. Jack's hands trembled as he shut and locked the door. He checked on the kids, finding them sound asleep, their small chests rising and falling peacefully. Returning to the bedroom, he whispered to Emily, "It's nothing, just something weird with the wind." Neither of them slept much after that. At 3 a.m., the noises began again, but this time they came from the roof. Heavy, deliberate thuds, as if someone or something was walking up there. Emily clutched Jack's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "It can't be an animal," she whispered. "Not out here." Jack grabbed a kitchen knife and his flashlight, his mind racing. He climbed up to the attic, the wooden steps creaking beneath his weight. The air grew colder the higher he went. And by the time he reached the attic, he could see his breath misting in the beam of his flashlight. The attic was empty, the bare beams and insulation undisturbed. But then, just as Jack turned to leave, he noticed something on the windowsill. A small handprint, too small to be an adult's, but oddly elongated with fingers that seemed unnaturally thin. The sight made his blood run cold. As he descended, he heard a soft giggle echo through the house. It wasn't Sophie or Max. It was too distorted, too wrong. Jack froze, listening. The giggle came again, this time closer. "Emily?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He rushed to their bedroom, only to find the bed empty, the sheets tossed aside. "Emily!" he shouted now, panic taking hold. He sprinted to the children's rooms. Sophie's bed was empty, the covers thrown to the floor. Max's room was the same, and then he saw them. In the living room, by the dim light of the dying fire, stood 3 figures. They were small, childlike in shape, but their proportions were all wrong. Their limbs were too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their mouths stretched into impossibly wide grins. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were holding hands with Sophie and Max. The children's faces were blank, their eyes unfocused. Emily stood nearby, her head lolling to one side as if she were in a trance. "What do you want?" Jack croaked, gripping the knife tightly. One of the figures tilted its head further, almost upside down, and spoke in a voice that sounded like the crunch of snow underfoot. "You left the door open for us. We've come to play." Jack lunged at them, but the figures moved with inhuman speed, scattering like shadows. The room plunged into darkness, and Jack felt a sharp pain at the back of his head before everything went black. When he woke, the house was silent again. The fire was out, the room icy cold. Emily and the children were back in their beds, seemingly unharmed but deeply asleep. Jack shook them, but they wouldn't wake. It was as if they were trapped in some dreamless void. And then he noticed the note on the mantel, written in jagged, childlike handwriting. "Thanks for letting us in. See you next Christmas."
Story number 2.
The snowstorm came out of nowhere, blanketing the small town of Millhaven in eerie silence. Alice, a single mother of 2, had been rushing home from her late shift at the diner, anxious to get back to her kids. Christmas Eve was supposed to be magical, but tonight felt anything but. The roads were deserted, the houses dark, and the howling wind carried an unnatural chill. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she noticed something odd. The front door of her house was slightly ajar. Frowning, she killed the engine and stepped out into the freezing night. Snow crunched under her boots as she hurried up the porch steps. "Emma? Tyler?" she called, her voice trembling. Her kids, 12 and 8, were supposed to be asleep. They were too young to leave the house without supervision, and she was certain she had locked the door before leaving. The house was deathly quiet as she stepped inside. The Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its twinkling lights casting faint, multicolored shadows. Stockings hung by the fireplace, untouched. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Kids, are you playing a prank on me?" Alice asked, trying to steady her voice. No answer. She set her purse down and walked toward the staircase, her footsteps echoing. As she climbed, the wooden steps creaked, each sound amplified in the silence. Her heart raced when she noticed faint, wet footprints leading up the stairs, footprints too large to belong to her children. "Emma? Tyler?" she called again, her voice breaking. At the top of the stairs, she noticed the prints led to Tyler's room. Pushing the door open, she found the room empty. His bed was neatly made, the stuffed animals he always slept with lined up against the pillows. The only thing out of place was the window. It was wide open, snow piling up on the windowsill and floor. Cold wind howled into the room. Alice rushed to the window and peered outside. Her stomach dropped. There were no footprints leading away from the house, just an unbroken blanket of snow. She slammed the window shut and turned to find Emma standing in the doorway. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes wide. "Mom," Emma whispered. "He's in the house." Alice froze. "Who's in the house?" Emma didn't answer. Instead, she pointed down the hall toward the attic door. The pull string dangled, swaying slightly as if someone had just climbed up. "Stay here," Alice ordered, though her voice betrayed her fear. She grabbed a heavy flashlight from Tyler's room and approached the attic. The house was too quiet, every creak and groan of the old wood echoing like a scream. She tugged the string, and the attic door creaked open. A narrow ladder unfolded, leading up into the darkness. Alice shone her flashlight up, the beam slicing through the pitch black. The attic was cluttered with old boxes and forgotten decorations, but nothing seemed out of place. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. And then she heard it, a faint, raspy breathing, coming from the far corner of the attic. Her flashlight swept across the space, and that's when she saw him. He was crouched among the boxes, his back to her. His limbs were unnaturally long, his shoulders hunched. His skin was pale and mottled, like wax left too close to a flame. As the light hit him, he turned his head slowly, his neck cracking with the motion. His face was wrong. Sunken eyes, a too-wide smile filled with yellow, jagged teeth. Alice's breath caught in her throat as he spoke, his voice a guttural rasp. "You left the door open for me." Before she could scream, the figure lunged. She swung the flashlight wildly, hitting him, but it felt like striking a sack of wet sand. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alice scrambled down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut. She grabbed Emma's hand and raced to Tyler's room. He was still asleep, oblivious to the terror around them. "Wake up!" Alice shook him, but Tyler wouldn't stir. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold. Emma tugged at her arm. "Mom, we have to leave, now." Alice hesitated, glancing back toward the attic. The pull string swayed violently, as if the thing up there was trying to get out. Without another thought, she scooped Tyler into her arms and bolted downstairs, Emma close behind. They fled into the snow-covered night, running toward the neighbor's house. The storm seemed to grow fiercer, the wind howling like a living thing. As they reached the porch, Alice glanced back at her house. The attic window was open now, and the figure stood there, watching them. His too long arm waved slowly, mockingly, as his smile stretched impossibly wide. Inside the house, the Christmas tree lights flickered once and then went out. The Baxter family never spent another Christmas in that house, but every year on Christmas Eve they receive a package at their new address. Inside is always the same thing, a snow globe with a miniature version of their old house inside, and in the attic window of the snow globe stands a small, pale figure smiling.
Story number 3.
The quiet cul-de-sac of Evergreen Lane was a picturesque sight, especially at Christmas. Every house sparkled with strings of lights, inflatable snowmen, and glowing reindeer. Except for one, the Walters house at the very end. It stood dark and cold, its curtains perpetually drawn, despite the season. Tom, a young delivery driver, hated stopping there. Rumors about the Walters family circulated in town, how they disappeared one Christmas Eve years ago, leaving behind an uneaten dinner and a still-burning fireplace. No one knew what happened, but the house remained frozen in time, untouched, unclaimed. It was Christmas Eve, and Tom's route ended with a single package destined for the Walters' address. He considered skipping it. No one had lived there for years. But curiosity got the better of him. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the house. The package was small and wrapped in brown paper, tied with a crimson ribbon. There was no return address, only the recipient's name written in elegant script, the Walters family. When Tom reached the porch, the door creaked open before he could knock. A rush of warm air greeted him, carrying the faint scent of cinnamon and pine. The house was not abandoned. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and the glow of a Christmas tree illuminated the living room. "Hello?" Tom called, stepping inside. "Delivery for the Walters family." No response. He placed the package on a nearby table and turned to leave, but a framed photo on the mantel caught his eye. It showed a family, a father, mother, and 2 children, smiling in front of a Christmas tree. The image was grainy, and the edges of the photo were burnt. As he studied the picture, a soft giggle echoed through the house. Tom froze. The sound was faint, like a child playing hide-and-seek. "Hello?" he called again, his voice trembling. The giggle came again, this time from the direction of the tree. Tom turned slowly, his heart pounding. One of the ornaments, a glass bauble painted with snowy scenes, was spinning on its own. He stepped closer and peered inside. Reflected in the glass was not the living room, but a scene of chaos. A family sat at the dinner table, their faces twisted in terror. Blood smeared the walls, and the father appeared to be screaming, though no sound came through. Tom stumbled back, knocking the ornament from the tree. It shattered on the floor, and with it, the warmth in the house vanished. The fire extinguished itself, and the room plunged into darkness. Then he heard it. The sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, growing closer. He shone his phone's flashlight toward the staircase. A figure descended, a man in a tattered suit, his face pale and eyes hollow. Behind him, more figures emerged. A woman in a blood-stained dress, 2 children clutching melted candles. Their movements were jerky, like puppets on strings. Tom backed toward the door, his breath coming in short gasps. The figures stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staring at him with unblinking eyes. The man raised a hand, pointing to the package Tom had left on the table. "You brought it back," the man said, his voice a raspy whisper. "It's yours now." Tom didn't wait to understand. He turned and ran into the snow, slipping and falling as he scrambled to his van. As he sped away, the house disappeared in the rearview mirror. But the package wasn't left behind. It sat on the passenger seat, the crimson ribbon now untied. When Tom reached the safety of his apartment, he threw the package into the dumpster and locked every door and window. But as he settled into bed, a knock echoed from his front door. On the doorstep was the package, pristine and waiting. This time, the tag bore his name. Tom was never seen again. The Walters house remains dark, but each Christmas Eve, another name appears on the package, and another soul is claimed by whatever lurks inside that cursed home.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm had swallowed the town whole, leaving everything buried under a thick, icy blanket. Despite the brutal cold, the Johnson family was in good spirits. It was their first Christmas in their newly bought countryside home, an old Victorian that had stood vacant for years. They were determined to make it special, even if the nearest neighbor was miles away. The tree was decorated, stockings were hung, and a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Lisa, the mother, was in the kitchen baking cookies while her husband, Mark, finished assembling a train set for their 7-year-old daughter, Abby. The evening felt cozy, magical even, until they heard the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the howling wind. Mark looked up, puzzled. Who could that be? In this storm? Lisa shrugged, wiping her hands on a towel. Maybe someone stranded on the road? Mark walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. Nobody was there. Frowning, he opened the door slightly and was greeted by a blast of icy wind. The porch was empty, the snow pristine and undisturbed. Kids, Mark muttered, closing the door and locking it, but the knock came again, louder this time. Abby, who had been playing with her dolls, looked up. Daddy, is it Santa? Mark forced a laugh. No, sweetheart, probably just the wind. Lisa joined him at the door. Are you sure you didn't see anyone? Positive. There's no one out there. As they stood there, the knock sounded again, now coming from the back door. The hairs on Mark's neck stood up. He motioned for Lisa to stay put and walked cautiously to the kitchen. The back door had a small frosted window, and as Mark approached, he saw a shadow move on the other side. Hello? He called, his voice shaking slightly. Do you need help? No answer, just silence. Lisa appeared behind him, whispering, What is it? I think someone's out there, he said, his eyes never leaving the door. Stay with Abby. Lisa hesitated but nodded, retreating to the living room. Mark unlocked the back door and swung it open. The snow was undisturbed here too, no footprints leading to or from the house. His breath clouded in the freezing air as he stepped outside, scanning the yard. The storm seemed to grow quieter, the wind dropping to an unnatural stillness. That's when he saw it. Near the edge of the yard, just at the tree line, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, wrapped in what looked like tattered, dark fabric. The figure didn't move, but its head seemed to tilt slightly, as if studying him. Hey, Mark shouted, his voice trembling. Who are you? Do you need help? The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a long, spindly arm and pointed directly at him. Mark felt an icy dread seep into his bones. He backed into the house and slammed the door, locking it. When he turned around, Lisa and Abby were standing in the kitchen doorway, their faces pale. What is it? Lisa asked. Someone's outside, Mark said. I don't know who, but they're just standing there. As he spoke, the knocking started again, this time from every door and window in the house. It wasn't random, it was synchronized, a steady rhythmic pounding that seemed to surround them. Abby clutched Lisa's leg. Mommy, I'm scared. Lisa pulled her close, her own fear barely contained. Mark, what do we do? He grabbed his phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The pounding grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was growing impatient. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The family stood frozen, waiting, listening. Mark cautiously moved to the living room window and pulled back the curtain. The figure was now in their yard, much closer. Its face, or what should have been a face, was pale and featureless, like a blank mask. It raised its arm again, pointing at the house. Mark staggered back. We need to leave, now. But the storm, Lisa began, but Mark cut her off. Grab Abby. We can't stay here. As they hurried to the front door, Abby screamed. Standing inside the house, at the base of the stairs, was the figure. It hadn't opened the door or broken a window. It was just there, impossibly tall, its head tilting in that same curious way. The family backed away, huddling together. The figure slowly raised its arm, pointing not at them, but at the fireplace. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in shadow. What do you want? Mark shouted, his voice breaking. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it began to dissolve into a swirling mist, which drifted toward the fireplace and disappeared up the chimney. The house fell silent again, the warmth and coziness replaced by an oppressive chill. They didn't wait to find out if it would return. Grabbing only their coats and car keys, they fled into the storm, not stopping until they reached a nearby motel. When the police checked the house the next day, they found no sign of forced entry. But on the mantel above the fireplace, there was a single charred object, a small porcelain figurine of a faceless figure, pointing. To this day, the Johnsons refuse to speak of what happened that Christmas Eve. But every year, without fail, they receive a package in the mail. Inside is always the same porcelain figure, its hand forever pointing.
Story number 5.
The small town of Pine Hollow had always prided itself on its quaint Christmas traditions. The centerpiece of every holiday season was the annual tree lighting ceremony in the town square. This year, however, something was different. Something felt wrong. The tree stood taller than ever, an ancient pine rumored to be over a century old. It was beautiful but unnerving, its jagged branches clawing at the winter sky. Local legend claimed the tree had a dark history, rooted in a tragedy long forgotten, but most townsfolk dismissed it as a harmless story to spook children. Emily, a young journalist visiting family for the holidays, found herself drawn to the tree. As the town gathered for the lighting ceremony, she noticed a peculiar detail: the ornaments. They weren't the usual baubles and garlands. These were handmade, with twisted shapes and strange symbols painted on them. Some looked disturbingly human. Tiny faces, their mouths open in silent screams. The mayor stepped forward, microphone in hand. "And now, let's light up Pine Hollow's pride and joy." The crowd cheered, but Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. She couldn't take her eyes off the ornaments, which seemed to shimmer unnaturally under the dim light of the street lamps. When the switch was flipped, the tree erupted in a dazzling display of multicolored lights. The crowd gasped and clapped, but Emily saw something else. In the glow of the lights, shadows began to stretch and writhe like living things creeping along the snow. Then came the sound, a low, guttural groan that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. The crowd went quiet, the festive atmosphere evaporating in an instant. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered. Before anyone could respond, the lights on the tree began to flicker. The groan grew louder, turning into a chorus of anguished wails. The ornaments rattled violently, and one by one they began to fall, shattering on the ground. Emily's heart pounded as she backed away, her phone trembling in her hand as she tried to record what was happening. The tree's branches twisted unnaturally, reaching outward like skeletal fingers. The shadows beneath it grew darker, deeper, swallowing the light around them. Suddenly, one of the ornaments, a small, glassy face, burst into flames. The fire spread rapidly, climbing the tree as if feeding on something unseen. The crowd screamed and scattered, but Emily couldn't move, her eyes fixed on the inferno. From within the flames, shapes began to emerge, human shapes. They writhed and twisted, their features indistinct but horrifyingly real. Emily realized with a jolt of terror that the figures resembled the ornaments that had decorated the tree. One figure stepped forward, its charred face inches from Emily's. It opened its mouth, but instead of words, a chilling scream erupted, echoing in her ears like a violent wind. She stumbled back, falling into the snow as the figure reached for her. "Run!" someone yelled, breaking her trance. Emily scrambled to her feet and fled, the screams of the figures and the roar of the fire chasing her through the streets. By the time the fire department arrived, the tree had collapsed into ash, taking with it whatever horrors had been unleashed. The townspeople refused to speak of what they had seen. The mayor called it a tragic electrical fire, a freak accident. But Emily knew better. That night, as she sat in her room replaying the shaky footage on her phone, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Just before the figures emerged from the flames, the shadows beneath the tree formed a single word, carved into the snow: return. Emily never returned to Pine Hollow, but every Christmas she receives an anonymous postcard with an image of a twisted blackened tree and a single word scrawled on the back: soon.
Story number 6.
It was a week before Christmas, and the snowstorm had left the roads treacherous and the power lines down. Melanie, a college student stuck at her parents' house for the holiday break, had been home alone for 3 days. Her parents were stranded in another state due to the storm, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at her nerves. The house was an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by acres of snow-covered fields and dense woods. It was charming during the day, but at night, it felt like something out of a ghost story. The wind howled through the eaves, and the old wooden floors creaked under their own weight. Melanie tried to distract herself with Christmas movies and hot cocoa, but the feeling of unease was hard to shake. It started the first night, with faint noises outside, soft crunches in the snow as if someone was walking around the house. She'd checked, shining a flashlight out into the darkness, but saw nothing. By the third night, the noises had become more frequent. Footsteps circled the house, sometimes stopping near the windows. Melanie kept the curtains drawn and double-checked the locks, but it was hard to convince herself she was imagining things. That evening, as the wind screamed outside, Melanie settled into the couch with a blanket and her laptop. The internet was spotty, but she managed to stream part of a Christmas movie before it cut out entirely. With a frustrated sigh, she closed the laptop and decided to head to bed. As she walked through the darkened house, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from her mom, or so she thought, until she opened it. The message was a photo. It was blurry, taken from outside a window, but she could clearly see herself sitting on the couch, laptop in hand. Her blood ran cold. Her phone buzzed again. Another photo. This time, it was a picture of her bedroom window, taken from outside. The light was off, but she could see the faint outline of her bed and the stuffed animal she'd had since childhood sitting on the pillow. Melanie's heart pounded as she locked every door and window in the house. She tried calling the police, but the storm had knocked out the phone lines and her cell service was useless. She grabbed a kitchen knife and huddled in the living room, trying to convince herself it was a prank. Maybe someone from town had too much time on their hands. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows and making the house groan, and then she heard it, a soft tapping on the living room window. Tap, tap, tap. Melanie froze. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. She clenched the knife tighter and forced herself to peek through a gap in the curtain. There was no one there, only the endless expanse of snow and the black silhouette of the woods in the distance. The tapping stopped, but before she could relax, it started again, this time from the back door. She ran to the kitchen and turned on all the lights, her hands trembling. The back door had a small window, and Melanie could barely bring herself to look. But when she did, her stomach dropped. There, in the fogged glass, was the imprint of a hand. It wasn't pressed against the glass, it was on the inside. Melanie screamed and spun around, but the kitchen was empty. She backed into the corner, holding the knife in front of her like a shield. The house felt impossibly quiet now, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Her phone buzzed again. Another photo. This one was taken from inside the house of the living room. The angle was low, as if someone had been crouching in the corner. Tears streamed down her face as she typed a desperate message to her parents, praying the text would somehow send. But as she hit send, she heard it. A single soft footstep on the floorboards behind her. Melanie turned, knife raised, but there was nothing there, just the darkened hallway leading to the front door. The storm finally subsided by morning, and when the police arrived, they found Melanie's phone and knife lying on the kitchen floor. The house was empty, and there were no footprints in the snow outside. The only clue was a single ornament hanging from the Christmas tree. It hadn't been there before, a small glass ball with a tiny curled-up figure inside. When they looked closer, they realized the figure was wearing Melanie's pajamas.
Story number 7.
The air was cold and biting as Greg, an overnight security guard, clocked in for his shift at Frost Hill Mall on Christmas Eve. The mall had closed early, leaving the vast empty halls eerily quiet. Strings of festive lights and garlands hung from every railing, and oversized nutcrackers stood like sentinels at every corner. Despite the holiday decorations, the mall had always felt too big, too hollow, especially at night. Greg had worked there for years and knew every creak and shadow, but something about this particular night felt different. The snowstorm outside howled against the glass dome ceiling, and the dim emergency lighting cast long, twisting shadows across the walls. His shift began like any other. He made rounds through the darkened corridors, checking the storefronts to ensure they were secure. The stillness was unnerving, but he had grown used to it, or so he thought. As he passed the central atrium, he stopped. Something caught his eye. One of the Christmas decorations, a large Santa mannequin sitting in a sleigh surrounded by mechanical reindeer, seemed off. The reindeers' heads were all turned in one direction, facing him. Greg shook his head and muttered to himself. It was probably just his imagination or a prank left by one of the mall employees. He continued his patrol, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. But as he moved from one wing of the mall to the next, the strange occurrences multiplied. At a clothing store, a mannequin stood just inside the glass, wearing a Santa hat and a grin that seemed too wide. Greg swore it hadn't been there earlier. He shone his flashlight on it, the beam reflecting off its lifeless eyes. Shrugging it off as someone's idea of a joke, he moved on. In the food court, the faint sound of bells jingling made him freeze. The mall speakers were off, and the sound wasn't coming from his radio. He spun around, the light from his flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The jingling grew louder, coming from the direction of the atrium. Greg's hand hovered over his radio, debating whether to call for backup. But who would respond on Christmas Eve during a snowstorm? He decided to investigate. When he reached the atrium again, the Santa display was different. The reindeer were no longer facing him. Instead, they had turned toward the exit, their mechanical heads now frozen mid-snarl, as if ready to charge. And Santa's head had tilted to the side, his hollow eyes staring directly at Greg. "Who's there?" Greg demanded, his voice echoing through the empty mall. His only answer was the faint jingle of bells and the wind's relentless howl against the glass. He backed away, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Suddenly the lights in the atrium flickered, plunging him into near darkness. The only light came from the strings of Christmas bulbs, which began to pulse like a heartbeat. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Greg's heart pounded as he spun around, trying to locate the source. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the vast space. He caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the columns. "Show yourself!" he yelled, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. Then, from behind him, a deep, gravelly voice whispered, "Have you been good this year?" Greg spun around, but no one was there. The sleigh display, however, was empty. Santa and the reindeer were gone. He stumbled backward, his breath visible in the icy air. His flashlight flickered, and in its intermittent glow, he saw them. Shadows, tall and hulking, moving toward him from every direction. At the center of them was a figure in a tattered red suit, a face obscured by a mask-like grin. Greg turned and ran, his boots echoing against the tile. He didn't look back, even as the jingling of bells and heavy footsteps pursued him. He reached the security office and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. He grabbed the phone, but the line was dead. On the security monitors, the cameras flickered between static and distorted images of the mall. In one feed, he saw the Santa figure standing at the entrance of a toy store, staring directly into the camera. In another, the reindeer were scattered across the food court, their heads bent at unnatural angles. The final feed showed the security office door. Greg's blood froze as the camera captured the shadow of something massive standing just outside. The doorknob rattled, and the jingle of bells filled the room. The lights went out, plunging him into darkness. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the deep, guttural laugh of something that was not human. The next morning, when the mall staff arrived, they found the security office empty. Greg's flashlight lay on the floor, its bulb shattered. The Santa display in the atrium was back in place, but now a new mannequin had been added, a security guard, frozen mid-scream, clutching a flashlight.
Story number 8.
The snow fell thick and fast on Christmas Eve, blanketing the small town of Pine Hollow in an eerie silence. Riley had always loved spending the holidays at her grandmother's cabin deep in the woods, but this year was different. Her grandmother had passed away earlier in the year, leaving the cabin empty. Still, Riley decided to honor the family tradition and spend Christmas there, alone. The cabin was warm and cozy, with a crackling fire and the faint smell of pine lingering in the air. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but Riley felt safe, wrapped in a blanket with a mug of hot cocoa in hand. She put on an old Christmas record and let the familiar tunes fill the space. It was around 10 p.m. when the strange occurrences began. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping on the window. Riley assumed it was a tree branch swaying in the wind. But when she looked outside, there was no branch near the window, only the untouched expanse of snow. Shrugging it off, she returned to the couch, telling herself it was her imagination. But then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate crunches in the snow, just outside the front door. Riley froze, her heart pounding. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the storm made it impossible for anyone to be out there. She grabbed her phone, but the signal was weak. Her only option was to wait it out and hope whoever or whatever was out there would go away. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then came a knock, 3 sharp raps against the door. Riley's blood ran cold. "Hello?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. Just silence. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there, but as she turned to walk away, another knock sounded, this time louder, blithe, more insistent. "Who's there?" she demanded, clutching a fire poker for protection. Still no response. The knocking stopped, but as Riley stood there, her breath visible in the cold air, she noticed something. The Christmas record, which had been playing softly in the background, began to warp. The cheerful tune slowed, the notes stretching into a distorted, haunting melody. Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness. Riley's breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate. She decided to make a run for the bedroom where she could lock the door and wait until morning. As she moved through the cabin, she felt it. A presence. Something watching her. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. She reached the bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. She crawled into the corner, clutching her phone and the fire poker. Her flashlight illuminated the room, revealing the old family photos on the walls. That's when she noticed it. One of the photos, a picture of her grandmother sitting by the Christmas tree, had changed. The figure of her grandmother was gone, replaced by a shadowy silhouette with glowing red eyes. The longer Riley stared, the more she realized the eyes were moving, shifting to look directly at her. Her phone buzzed, and she nearly dropped it. A notification popped up, a text message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. The message read, "Let me in." Her hands trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came instantly, "I'm already here." At that moment, a faint jingling sound filled the room, like the soft chime of bells. Riley's flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, she saw something move in the corner of the room. When the light steadied, it revealed a figure standing there, a gaunt, hollow-faced man in a tattered Santa suit. His eyes burned with an unnatural glow, and his grin stretched impossibly wide. Riley screamed and threw the fire poker, but the figure didn't flinch. It stepped closer, the jingling of bells growing louder. "Why are you doing this?" she sobbed, backing into the wall. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "Christmas is for company," it whispered in a voice that sounded like cracking ice. Riley's flashlight died completely, plunging the room into pitch black. The last thing she heard before everything went silent was the sound of bells jingling, closer and closer. When the storm cleared the next day, the cabin stood empty. The only sign of Riley was a single snow angel outside the front door, surrounded by perfectly undisturbed snow.
Story number 9.
The blizzard had started earlier than predicted, trapping Lena and her husband Daniel in their remote cabin deep in the mountains. They had planned a cozy Christmas getaway, far from the city noise, with nothing but the crackling fireplace, warm drinks, and a tree decorated with handmade ornaments. As the storm raged outside, they laughed and reminisced, enjoying the solitude. But by nightfall, an uneasiness crept into the cabin. It began with a single knock on the window. Both froze, their mugs of hot cider paused mid-sip. Daniel frowned. "It's probably just a branch," he said, rising to check. But when he pulled back the curtain, his expression hardened. "There's nothing out there." Lena joined him, peering out into the darkness. The snow was falling thick, but the porch light illuminated something strange, a single set of footprints leading to the window. They ended there. No tracks leading away. "Maybe it's just an animal," Lena suggested weakly, though the size of the prints looked unmistakably human. Daniel shrugged it off and bolted the door. "Storm's playing tricks on us," he muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. The hours ticked by, the wind howling like a living thing. Lena tried to focus on the old holiday movie playing on the TV, but her mind kept returning to the footprints. She felt watched, though Daniel insisted it was just her imagination. Then came the second knock. This time, it wasn't at the window, but on the front door. A deep, deliberate pounding. Daniel grabbed the poker from the fireplace and motioned for Lena to stay back. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. Lena's breath hitched as the sound reverberated through the cabin. Daniel swung open the door, ready to confront whoever was outside. But the porch was empty. The footprints from earlier were gone, buried under fresh snow, but a new set of tracks had appeared, circling the cabin. "Get inside," Lena urged, pulling him back. He slammed the door shut, bolting it again. "I'm going to check the generator," Daniel said, grabbing a flashlight. "Are you crazy?" Lena hissed. "Something or someone is out there." He hesitated, but eventually relented, deciding to wait until morning. They huddled together, tension crackling in the air as the storm grew fiercer. Around midnight, the power flickered and went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Lena grabbed a candle while Daniel cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. Then they heard it, a sound that made their blood run cold. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the cabin. It was a low, guttural laugh coming from just outside the door. "Daniel," Lena whispered, clutching his arm. The laugh came again, louder, closer. A scraping sound followed, like nails dragging across the wooden door. Daniel raised the flashlight and pointed at the door, but there was no shadow visible beneath it. The laugh stopped. Silence filled the cabin, except for their ragged breathing. Then, without warning, the back door slammed open. Snow swirled into the room, along with a blast of icy wind. The candles blew out, leaving them in pitch black. "Stay here!" Daniel yelled, running toward the back with the flashlight. Lena grabbed the fireplace poker and stood frozen, listening to his footsteps receding. "Daniel?" she called after a moment. No response. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she crept toward the back of the cabin. The flashlight beam lay abandoned on the floor, casting an eerie glow on the walls. The door was wide open, snow piling inside. "Daniel!" she screamed, stepping outside into the storm. His footprints were visible, leading toward the woods. She hesitated, fear clawing at her chest, but she couldn't leave him out there. She followed the tracks, the cold biting through her coat. The footprints led deeper into the woods, then suddenly stopped. There, in the snow, was Daniel's flashlight, still on, but no sign of him. "Daniel!" she cried, her voice swallowed by the storm. The laugh came again, this time behind her. Lena spun around, gripping the poker tightly. A figure loomed in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. It wore what looked like a tattered red coat, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. "Daniel?" she whispered, though she knew it wasn't him. The figure took a step closer, the snow beneath it undisturbed. As it neared, she saw its face, sunken eyes, pale skin stretched tight over its skull, and a grin that seemed carved into its flesh. Lena turned and ran, her breath coming in gasps. The cabin was barely visible now, a faint glow in the storm. Behind her, the laughter grew louder, closer. She reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, bolting it. Her heart pounded as she pressed her ear to the wood, listening for any sound. Then she heard it, a soft knock followed by a voice. Daniel's voice. "Lena, let me in." Her hand hovered over the lock. "Daniel, it's me, babe. Open the door." But something in his tone was wrong, flat, emotionless. She didn't move. "Lena," the voice said again, sharper this time. "Let me in." The laughter returned, echoing through the cabin, followed by a deep, rasping whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." The next morning, rescue workers found the cabin buried in snow. Inside, the fireplace was cold, the doors bolted. They found Lena curled in the corner, her eyes wide open, staring blankly. Around her neck hung a string of bells, their chime faint and hollow. Outside, the snow was pristine, except for a single set of footprints leading away, disappearing into the woods.
Story number 10.
The town of Winter's Hollow was known for its picturesque holiday charm, twinkling lights, snow-dusted streets, and an annual Christmas market that drew visitors from all around. But beneath its festive exterior lay a chilling legend, the story of the Frost Watcher. No one could agree on where the legend began, but everyone knew the warning. If you were alone on Christmas Eve and heard a faint whistling outside your window, you must never look. The Frost Watcher would be there, and those who met his gaze were never seen again. Jessica didn't believe in town legends. She had moved to Winter's Hollow recently to escape the chaos of the city and wasn't interested in small-town superstitions. When her neighbors warned her about spending Christmas Eve alone, she laughed it off. She had plans, a warm fire, a good book, and a bottle of wine. By 9 p.m., the snowstorm had grown fierce, the wind howling through the trees. Jessica sat curled on the couch, the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. She was halfway through her book when she noticed it, the faint sound of whistling. It was soft at first, barely audible over the storm. She paused, thinking it was the wind playing tricks on her. but the melody was too distinct, too deliberate. A slow, haunting tune that sent a shiver down her spine. She got up and approached the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. Outside, the snow swirled in the glow of the street lamp, but the street was empty. The whistling grew louder. Jessica's heart raced as she moved to the front door. She hesitated, then cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The cold air bit at her face. There was no one there, just the undisturbed blanket of snow. Closing the door, she locked it and returned to the living room. The whistling had stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Hours passed, and Jessica convinced herself it was nothing. A neighbor playing a prank, perhaps. She poured another glass of wine and settled back on the couch. But as the clock struck midnight, the sound returned. This time it was closer, almost as if it were coming from inside the house. Her stomach dropped. She turned off the music playing on her phone, straining to hear. The whistling drifted through the air, echoing faintly. Slowly, she followed the sound to the hallway. The air was colder there, her breath visible in the dim light. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. The whistling continued, leading her to the door of the guest room she hadn't used since moving in. The doorknob felt icy to the touch as she turned it, pushing the door open. The room was empty, but the frost-covered window was wide open. Snow had blown in, covering the floor. Jessica's heart pounded as she rushed to close it. Out of breath, but as she reached out, the whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps behind her. She froze. Turning slowly, she saw him. A figure stood in the corner of the room, tall and impossibly thin, cloaked in white. His face was pale and skeletal, with deep, hollow sockets where his eyes should have been. His lips were cracked and blue, forming a small, cruel smile. Jessica backed away, her legs trembling. Who are you?" she whispered. The figure raised a long, bony finger to his lips, a soundless shushing gesture. The room seemed to grow colder, the frost creeping up the walls. Jessica's breath hitched as she tried to move, but her limbs felt frozen in place. The Frost Watcher stepped closer, his movements impossibly smooth, as if he were gliding. His hollow sockets locked onto her, and she felt an unbearable pressure, like 1,000 voices screaming in her mind. She turned and ran, slamming the door behind her. The whistling resumed, now echoing throughout the house. She stumbled into the living room, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. The screen flickered, then went dark. Every light in the house followed suit, leaving her in complete darkness. The whistling was right behind her now, accompanied by a faint, icy breath on the back of her neck. Jessica screamed and bolted for the door, flinging it open and running into the storm. She didn't stop running, her bare feet crunching through the snow, the icy wind cutting into her skin. She reached the center of town, collapsing beneath the towering Christmas tree in the square. The lights twinkled cheerfully above her, a stark contrast to the terror that gripped her. But as she caught her breath, she realized the whistling hadn't stopped. It was all around her, echoing through the empty streets. She looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the square, his skeletal frame silhouetted against the glowing lights. The last thing Jessica saw before everything went black was the Frost Watcher's hollow gaze locking onto hers, his smile widening. When morning came, the townspeople found the square untouched, the Christmas lights twinkling in the sunlight. But Jessica was gone, her footsteps ending abruptly in the snow. All that remained was a faint, haunting whistle carried by the wind.